Right. So just to suggest to you what I might be able to do for you and to manage your expectations. So I'm not a philosopher or a political theorist or a historian. I'm a sociologist, so I'm not a psychologist, so you don't have to sort of start booing me now, but I am, as a sociologist, I've been researching, as Ellie said, parenting culture for the past 14 years down at the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies. And when we developed the centre, we called our approach Parenting Culture Studies, which nobody else was using that term, because we recognised that a new framework was required to engage with the way in which the family was now being talked about. Since the late 1990s, the term parenting has become ubiquitous in government policy concerning families. Parenting tends to be used, which seems like a necessary adjustment, parenting tends to be used, which seems like a sort of necessary adjustment to the convergence of roles of mothers and fathers afforded by greater gender equality. But parenting has got different connotations as well. For example, very different to child rearing or bringing up a child or to socialisation as well. And the official adoption and promotion of the term coincided with a huge amount of commercially available guidance being offered and sold to mothers and fathers to help them in the pursuit of this thing called parenting. We also realised, this is just a very simple Google Ngram diagram, which shows that from 1960 onwards, that's when the term parenting becomes a word that is used. So what we realised, as well as that there is something that's gone on in culture and in policy concerning the way the family was being approached, we also realised that for some individuals, the family was really becoming something very different for them as well. And we realised that some of the decisions that parents make, most obviously whether to feed babies from a bottle or from the breast, had somehow, during the 1990s, become issues of global importance, of interest to national governments and to agencies of international governance such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the OECD. Policies had been drawn up at all levels with the aim of persuading more mothers to embrace a new ideal, that of the breastfeeding mother. And this seemed rather odd to us, that these international bodies should be so concerned with what women do with their breasts. Not only that, but some individuals seem to have attached themselves very firmly to the side of breasts to such an extent that they ferociously, sorry, these are really cheap kind of very innuendos, but people who know me will know that's what I do. They'd attached themselves very firmly into the breast camp, if you like, ferociously, and attacked those who they saw as constituting the evil forces of the bottle, the formula industry, outdated cultural norms which distance us from our babies, or which estrange us from nature, and the patriarchal sexualization of women's breasts which had alienated us from breasts' proper purpose. The most fervent activists saw their cause not just as one of improving public health, but as political and moral. Politically, to combat the marketisation of infant care and to lobby for government support for breastfeeding in institutions and the workplace, and morally to strengthen maternal-child bonds and make the world a less violent, happier place by awakening mothers to the potency of breastfeeding as a bridge to a happier family and a happier future. We also recognise that for many new mothers, the turning of infant feeding into a political and moral project often put them into conflict with their husbands, their partners, grandparents, other parents, and also even with their own babies. And so it seemed back at the start, when we were starting to think about how we might approach understanding what was going on, that within this contemporary parenting culture, there were some rather odd issues arising around the question of identity. And what I want to be able to do, hopefully, is just to sort of throw some things out which I will engage with the kind of reading that you've been doing, where the connection is made between the culture wars and identity. I suppose when you think about the family, it's not really surprising that identity would be a key issue there. The family being a set of relations where the primary identity formation of the child takes place. As the historian Leonora Davidoff puts it, not thinking so much in psychological terms, but kind of rooting the child in the family as a place where a very fundamental sense of belonging is formed. When the child asks, "Who am I?" he or she learns that the assignment of a first name places them within a gender group, a second name within a family and kin group. This then leads to the question, who are we and how do we relate to a wider whole? It is only possible to answer this by establishing who we are not. Identity is created through establishing difference, by demarking us and them. These are not only rational, but also emotional imperatives couched in the language of morality. What we do is right. As the person matures, these questions extend to who do I trust? What is the group that I use as my reference point for how a life should be lived? But the family is also the institution through which adults shift identity. They become mothers and fathers, not just in the biological sense, but legally and socially. And what I'm hoping to do is to explore what we mean by the culture wars, the significance of identity to them, and the centrality to them as well of the question of authority. So first of all, some observations from the world of family sociology. So you have to imagine me or Ellie sitting in a room with other academics, usually women, in the world of family sociology. And this is just some of the things that I was thinking about that tend to occur. First of all, it's impossible to describe anyone or any family as normal. The normal family is now cast as the heteronormative family, and that's an ideological imposition upon us with negative rather than positive connotations. Secondly, if you're in a room talking about parent-child relationships and family life, sometimes someone will object to the use of the term family at all. Not just the family, but family at all, as being a word that we should no longer use. Thirdly, it's pretty impossible to talk about a maternal instinct, and there's a reluctance to use the word love to describe what goes on between husbands and wives, parents and children. Fourthly, if you mention authority or discipline, some people will squirm uncomfortably or roll their eyes, and you immediately feel very self-conscious about anything else you might say that might mark you out as a conservative caricature. You have to kind of ration your dinosaur tendencies in this milieu. And fifth, when anyone mentions children, someone will say, of course, we recognise that children do have agency. And when anyone mentions child development, somebody will say, of course, we should remember that children are not human becomings, they are human beings. Secondly, some observations from the world of family policy. So while there's a similar concern with the marginals of the people kind of doing the minority family practices, they're rather different to the kind of marginals who are of interest to academics. Academics are very interested in lesbian families, gay families, migrant families. Concern in policy is focused on those who've variously been described as the socially excluded, the hard-to-reach, troubled families or vulnerable families. The disorderly problem family located at the bottom of society and operating outside mainstream norms has of course been an object of concern for over 100 years. But during the late 1990s, the problem primarily became talked about as a problem not of poverty, but of poor parenting. Secondly, in the policy world, when mothers are talked about in policy discourse, they tend to be talked about as being victims of addiction, domestic violence, or mental health problems. And fathers are cast as shadowy figures who require help to engage with their own families through professional support. And this isn't me caricaturing, this is actually what it's like when you do an analysis of policy documents. Thirdly, you may have noticed that culturally, parents are everywhere. I read the Daily Mail, as amongst other newspapers, online, and you can't look at the sidebar of shame without there being a pregnant belly on display, every third image. Celebrities move from touting pop songs to displaying their bumps. Then it's on to breastfeeding selfies, and their struggles with postnatal anxiety and depression. Every miscarriage, no matter how early, is a dream of parenthood shattered and shared. And that's just the women. So, we've witnessed already, it feels a long time ago now, male politicians trying to connect with the public by letting it be known that they are hands-on fathers who are up in the night changing nappies. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Nick Clegg all made a great deal of the fact that they were new fathers and that they were engaged and somehow inexplicably awake in the night when you just knew that they weren't. Parenting, they say, is the hardest job in the world and the most important job in the world. The younger royals have also been high-profile promoters of this view. The other week, Prince William indicated that the royal family, the most visible symbol of the family in British life, has made something of a transition when he said that he would obviously be supportive if one of his children were gay, but would worry that they would experience prejudice, presumably from us. And this indicated a really quite profound shift away from the old-fashioned purpose of royal reproduction, which was to reproduce the bloodline, to secure inheritance, to serve as a publicly recognised symbol which can embody biologised national unity and historical continuity. So if the family is an institution which forms a bridge between the individual and society, then I think we can see that there's been a transformation in the way in which this bridging is now thought to happen, and in the ways in which all the parties are involved are conceptualised: parents, children, the community, and the state. And today a word I keep coming across when I look at policy and advocacy discourse is scaffolding. Scaffolding is the role of the midwife, the health visitor, the children's centre staff member. In the eyes of professionals and their advocates, when a baby is born, the parent requires scaffolding to make the transition to parenthood. They must be psychologically birthed through professional support, and the marker of their successful transition is when they realise that seeking help is the marker of a good parent. Any parent, whether council, estate mum, prime minister or heir apparent. This is why you have Kate and William and Meghan and Harry talking about their psychological struggles with adapting to parenthood. So what we have, I would say, is a parenting culture in which the parent is reconceptualized as a human becoming, with very little of the assumed competence, authority, or indeed spontaneous capacity for love, which was taken for granted in the vast majority of parents in the past. Previously, the hallmark of the 20th century good parent was that they accepted responsibility for bringing up the child independently, within the cultural norms of respectability. And this generally meant loving the child, providing for their material needs, developing their capacity for self-control, and teaching them the rules of society. Being well brought up meant that the child had internalized the virtues of being well-mannered, self-controlled, reasonable, hard-working, and educated. At the crudest level, they could fit into school and then into the world of work. But this was a rather reduced version of an earlier form of good parenting, good parenthood, where responsibility was also assumed for the child's spiritual and moral development. With secularization, this dimension of raising children tends to migrate into the sentimental and then the psychological, something we'll look at in a minute. So in the UK, as far as the state is concerned, families who required professional support in the past were profoundly dysfunctional, families who struggled to cope with life. These were the exceptions requiring special attention. But I think you could argue today that the family in need of support has been universalised and actually turned into the normative ideal. So that's a quick sketch of what might be happening to parents. What about children? I think up until quite recently, I might have said the kids are all right. Babies have been raised in all different ways in the past and in different types of human societies, with all kinds of different arrangements for their care. But this response was a sort of reactive counter to the increasingly anxious, risk-averse, officially sanctioned conformism of parenting culture, which Frank called paranoid back in 2001. But I think we, when I say we, I mean Ellie and myself and other people working on this, I think we're increasingly asking ourselves, what does this new cultural ideal of parenting mean for the child who is attributed agency and who has rights bestowed upon him, and who's apparently a human being rather than a nascent human becoming? The delicacy and vulnerability of you as a child, as a unique creature, renders you individuated from the off. The parent must watch you closely, attune to your individual needs and complex feelings, reflect on their own disposition, and only then act. This is the imperative of baby-led family life. Feelings of love must be subject to constant self-scrutiny and self-intervention. It's not surprising that feelings of ambivalence and estrangement are coming to the fore as increasingly prevalent experiences of early motherhood. And it's one of these paradoxes of what's going on, which is the greater attention that's paid to postnatal depression, the more postnatal depression seems to be a manifestation that's of parenting culture in the experience of very, very many mothers. So although culture and policy seem to be inordinately concerned with the development of a child's cognitive and emotional framework, in fact, I think there's a very crude and rigid understanding of this process today. The child is now conceptualized as determined not just through their experiences during the earliest years of life, but during a window of opportunity or a critical period which ends with infancy. The first 3 years or the first 1,001 days are what's talked of in policy terms as the period during which children are particularly susceptible to parental influence. And actually, the window of opportunity for their development slams shut at a very, very early stage. This is no longer the child, give me a child until they are 7 or 8. This is a child until the age of 1 or 2. The determining factors, even those which are conceived of as genetic or otherwise biological, are mediated through the parent's behaviour. Sometimes this is physical behaviour, maternal ingestion of alcohol or drugs, but it's also very often now the mother's emotional state that's being drawn to the fore, whether that's the fact that she's stressed or failing to bond with the child. These are the factors that are seen as being determinant of the child's long-term future. In much of the policy and advocacy literature, the focus is almost wholly on the mother. The father has all but disappeared except as a sinister figure who causes stress to the mother by committing domestic violence, or more positively is there to encourage the mother to avoid risks in pregnancy and to support her emotional bonding with the child. And so the child, the creature who is in fact in a constant state of developmental flux, is objectified as the anchor of meaning for the family, towards whom the good parent must enter into a state of constant reflective becoming. This requires the mediation of expert knowledge to help the parent interpret the child's needs, and official scaffolding to support the parent as they go through this vulnerable state of flux. So we have a paradox by which policy and other projects which aim to bring humans closer together and to unite the parent and child and strengthen family bonds has the unintended consequence of distancing them further from one another and of allowing the entry into their midst of friendly intruders. So child-centered thinking, I don't think, indicates an actual increase in sensitivity towards children and their development. I'm not even sure if it means we are softer on children than we used to be. In fact, we needily depend on them as validations of our own parental journey, controlling them by getting inside their heads, or at least that's what we think we're doing, shaping their brains. And in its most extreme form, maternal love is rendered material in the structure of the infant brain, visible through a brain scan, or in this case, I think, possibly even a dissection. So there seems to have occurred a significant change and possible reversal in the meanings of child and adult from the times of the Victorian family to the family as it's being conceptualised and institutionalised today. On the left, we've got the Victorian family, big one, built on gendered norms and unequal rights between men and women, actively pursuing micro-collective goals and contributing to the broader collective by raising good citizens. The father straddles the boundary between public and private. He's gifted authority over his wife and children by virtue of the fact that he has contracted to be the husband, assuming responsibility for bringing this family into being in a social sense and to move the children towards full independence. All children born to his wife are his, regardless of whether they are biologically his. And so the father is it's a social status. It's not a kind of biologized parental status. His wife, however, has moral authority by virtue of her womanhood and her capacities as a wife and mother. She brings order to the household and provides love and care to her husband and children. They are a unit in which it's relatively difficult for the state or anyone else to intercede. The family has privileged status. The normal rules of the public sphere do not apply. And we can see this being undone today, finally, with the smacking proposals that are being done, where the special privilege which is given to parents that they can chastise physically their child when nobody else can now is being undone. On the right, we have perhaps an unfairly unusual case, but one that's significant in that it's forcing the president of the family courts, Andrew McFarlane, to undertake a full review of its implications for family law. This is Freddie McConnell. He was born female, but in adulthood had her breasts removed and took hormone medication in order to live as a man. Through fertility treatment without a partner, he conceived and gave birth to a baby, but is now seeking to have himself listed on the child's birth certificate as the father, thereby challenging the current law, which determines that regardless of the genetic origins of the baby, the person who gives birth to the baby is its mother. I'm not putting this up here so that we can snigger at Freddie McConnell as a sort of sign of the times and we can all tut. I'm putting it up here because I think it does force us to consider what is the basis of parenthood and in what way should it map onto biology and onto the gendered identities of mother and father, and what is its relationship to official validation? What is it that really matters about the family, and what is it that we might want to defend? So in the rest of the lecture, I will just share some thoughts about how we've gone from the family on the left to the family on the right over the past 100 years, skipping lots of steps, and no doubt making plenty of errors, and I'm sure it's one-sided and probably wrong, but hopefully there'll be some things thrown out that will resonate with what Frank was talking about this morning, and also with the reading that you've done. But what I want us to be able to do is to rise above our gut reactions, whether they come from the kind of hell in a handcart side of things or the anything goes perspective, with some illustrations of the kinds of ideas which have attacked the family, I think. So today, first of all, I would say that the gender-neutral term parenting has been centre stage in family policy since the late 1990s, but feminists have pointed out that the expectations of mothers and fathers are still very distinct and are heavily weighted towards the mother. But both mothers and fathers are often designated by terms other than mother and father. There's a flattening out in the status and conceptualisation of the parent. They're often referred to as caregivers. If you've got children at school, you'll know that the letters addressed to you as a parent are often dear parents and caregivers, and then they'll talk about your child or the school or tell you off or something. You might be referred to as your child's first teacher, or as the uterine environment, which is particularly charming, in which a baby is conceived and gestated, or you may be talked about as constituting a home learning environment where children become school ready. Overall, there's an impoverished way of talking about the family, even when it's of central concern. Secondly, there's a fragmentation of the parental role. The role has been transformed into one that's broken down into discrete actions and behaviours, a set of skills and practices, which can then be evaluated by external forces. But both of these developments, I would say, rely on the prior ideological disaggregation of the family as a unit. And so I just want to then try to work through how that might come about, what kind of ideas have to be involved in that undoing. The bourgeois family, in legal terms, was a unification of property. The woman sacrificed her right to property to her husband on marriage. The later Victorian family, particularly when it extended beyond the middle class to those without property, became more of a sexual contract. A man and a woman, through getting married, attained official and moral sanction to have sex with each other, and the wife and her children were afforded certain financial and legal protections by the husband in return. Of course, not everyone did it this way. You only have to go back into your own families to know there were plenty of people doing things otherwise. But everyone would have known what the norms were, and many people would have taken it upon themselves to judge those who defied the rules and to stigmatise the child born illegitimately. Family formation through marriage, therefore, gained you privileged status as a legal, cultural and moral level relative to having sex or reproducing out of wedlock, all terms that we no longer use, illegitimate or out of wedlock. The family was institutionalised as a fundamental stabilising component of British society in a similar way to how Edmund Burke spoke of it all the way back in 1790. He talks about it as, the experience of being part of a family, to be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society, is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. It's the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love to our country and to mankind. The extension of the bourgeois family to the working class was partly achieved through the concerted efforts of 19th century philanthro-activists who were the precursors of the state and who evangelized the values of responsibility and respectability, sexual restraint, abstinence, financial probity, inculcating moral values into the child and handing them over for the newly compulsory education. These so-called shock troops of bourgeois women saw their mission as one of bringing enlightened motherhood to the masses. In this way, as the family was democratized, extended to those without property, the emotional and the sentimental side came increasingly to the fore in the authority that was given to the mother and the cultural cultivation of the ideal of the home as a haven in a heartless world. The target was mothers, I think, because their aspirations for healthier children, better behaved husbands, and higher status could be realized through an alliance with the new authority of science, medicine, and increasingly psychological expertise. And this is a nice little extract from Peter Pan, which when I had young children, I really loved this and thought, wow, this is great. This is what it feels like I'm doing. Now that I've got teenagers, I just think, you know, good luck with that. But Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for next morning, repacking into their proper places the many articles that have wandered during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch. It's quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you picked this thing up, making discoveries sweet and not so sweet, pressing this to her cheek as if it were a nice kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake in the morning, the naughtiness and evil passions with which you went to bed have been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your mind, and on the top, beautifully aired, and are spread out the prettier thoughts ready for you to put on. So I think this alliance between mothers and expert authority, particularly psychology as the 20th century goes on, represented a growth in women's authority, both of those evangelical women who attained a public role by bringing order to the private life of the working class, and for those mothers who had expert knowledge relative to their husbands. But it was authority legitimated by and shared with forces outside the family, and it also went alongside the cultural cultivation of the child as open-ended and close to nature, as a symbolic bridge between past, present, and future. The child increasingly gained a powerful moral authority, in particular the suffering child or the innocent child. And of course, the child's authority was based on his vulnerability, which required protection sometimes from his own parents by external actors. Because the family was conceptualized in largely naturalized terms, it was somewhat inevitably understood to be threatened by social forces. Part of the drive to universalize the ordering functions of the family emanated from repeated reformations of anxiety about the family as unable to cope with modernity, which I'm kind of is a very interesting idea, that why would we think that the family can't cope with social change? I do think that's quite an interesting thing. During the 1940s, I'm leaping forward a bit, the family becomes problematized in a new way. Rather than the family being unable to adapt to change, the family is blamed for change. Intellectuals struggling with the problems of fascism, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust arrive at the conclusion that it was social structures which render people irrational, prone to identifying and demonizing outsiders and looking to strong leaders. These social structures, they concluded, become embedded in the psyche of individuals and transmit their dysfunctionality through the process of raising children. Mum and dad don't just fuck you up, they fuck everything up. But at this stage, it's really a daddy issue. So in 1936, there's an essay by Max Horkheimer called Authority in the Family, in which he says, the individual mechanisms which operate in shaping the authority-oriented character within the family have been the object of investigation, especially of modern depth psychology. The latter has shown how the lack of independence, the deep sense of inferiority that afflicts most men, the centering of their whole psychic life around the ideas of order and subordination, but also their cultural achievements, are all conditioned by the relations of child to parents or their substitutes, and to brothers and sisters. Interesting that it extends beyond the parents at this stage. The concepts of repression and sublimation as the outcomes of conflict with social reality have greatly advanced our understanding of the phenomena mentioned. And it's this essay by Horkheimer, which is taken forward in 1950 by Adorno's study, The Authoritarian Personality, And what began as an attempt to understand and re-democratize Nazi Germany ended up as a study of over 2,000 Americans. And the problem of anti-Semitism, as it's understood through the authoritarian personality, which is a huge social survey, was diagnosed as being formed from the inclination to attribute persistent trends in the individual to something innate or basic or racial. The remedy to this tendency to see the individual as determined lay in the conception of the personality structure as being culturally specific. In other words, the tendency to racialize difference could be countered by the alternative conceptualization of the particular identities of individuals or groups as determined by their culture, giving rise to distinct personality structures. Personality structure, as a concept, represents the embedding of the past in the individual, but it's also the structure through which contemporary interactions occur, a kind of psychologized version of man makes history, but not in circumstances of his own making. According to Adorno, the way in which an infant's needs are met within the family shapes the personality and ultimately shapes ideology. Importantly, material interests for Adorno are not determinate of the individual or group behaviour, but rather it is the irrational forces of group identification which make things happen. This need is exploited through propaganda of those with economic power, appealing to the emotions of people. In particular, the child's affective dependence on fatherly authority, involving anxiety, love and hate, combined with an identification with paternal authority, a valuing of duty over happiness and guilt over the felt disjuncture between social reality and the demands of repression to the superego, breed a pathology within the family. So what we can see here, I think, is that the family, and particularly the father, is no longer conceptually independent of the public or political world, as they were when there was a more robust distinction between public and private, but it's now implicated in the public and political world. In fact, the father is the source of social and political ills. As we move through the 60s, the view that the patriarchal family, which by this stage is kind of gone, that's the wrong one, there we go, is the key evil. The idea that the authority of the father is the key evil to be undone gains strength. Very familiar in the kind of 1960s popular culture, where mothers and fathers are now estranged from their young people. The world has moved so much. Young people are kind of thrusting forwards and very in counterposition to what their parents might have known. The parents have nothing to offer to the younger generation. In the 1950s, however, we also have this a pronounced concern with mother love and the naturalness of mother love. So there's a search for, within biology in particular and within psychology, for a legitimation of maternal authority in the drives of the mother rather than the needs of the child. So are you familiar with the Harry Harlow experiments? Very, really popularised at the time, where it was concluded that monkeys, in order to physically thrive, needed not just food and water, they actually needed maternal love in the form of a slightly more cuddly frame. And actually the monkey would choose to gravitate towards the cuddly mother figure rather than the figure which actually contains food and drink. So there's a sense that the emotional needs of children was biologized. And this was alongside John Bowlby, who people know about with attachment theory. There's a real kind of fairly desperate sense that we need to figure out and be able to reinforce the bonds of maternal love as a way of kind of reconstituting social bonds in the world. Moving on from that to this quote from Erich Fromm, which indicates what might come next as we turn to thinking about the mother. So as Fromm says, we can say that the patricentric individual and society is characterized by a complex of traits in which the following are predominant: a strict superego, guilt feelings, docile love for paternal authority, desire and pleasure at dominating weaker people, acceptance of suffering as a punishment for one's own guilt, and a damaged capacity for happiness. The matricentric complex, by contrast, is characterized by a feeling of optimistic trust in mother's unconditional love, far fewer guilt feelings, a far weaker superego, and a greater capacity for pleasure and happiness. Along with these traits, there also develops the ideal of motherly compassion and love for the weak and others in need of help. So I don't have time to go into feminism's role in all this, but I think you can maybe see how what's the kind of way is set for sort of women to make certain claims about their role in the world. But although paradoxically, the mother's distinctive authority was undermined rather than expanded by feminism. The attempt to denaturalize maternal feeling, to separate it from womanhood, often involved the cultivation of disenchantment with the romanticized Victorian mother. So thinking about Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, this moved from the de-romanticizing to the pathologizing of maternal love, I think. According to Friedan, educated middle-class women were being driven nuts by the constraints of suburban motherhood, manically hoovering, drugged up on Valium, raising dysfunctional kids, especially homosexual mummies' boys, as a result. And the image of the mother as a dupe of patriarchal and capitalist social relations was taken forwards by campaigns that subsequently came about in the 70s alongside feminism. Oh, I've got this. I'd forgotten about the "Don't Do It, Die" badges when before Lady Diana got. So this is a quote from the Gay Liberation Front manifesto in 1971, which kind of takes forward this sort of real giving motherhood a kicking, I think. Were it not also for the captive wife, educated by advertising and everything she reads into believing that she needs ever more new goodies for the home, for her own beautification and for the children's well-being, our economic system could not function properly, depending as it does on people buying far more manufactured goods than they need. The housewife, obsessed with the ownership of as many material goods as possible, is the agent of this high level of spending. None of these goods will ever satisfy her, since there is always something better to be had, and the surplus of these pseudo-necessities goes hand in hand with the absence of genuinely necessary goods and services, such as adequate housing and schools. And this is the kind of view of motherhood, I think, that I was raised with very much in the 70s and 80s, which is that women, the housewife was a very silly figure who is kind of lacks all the authority that the Victorian housewife had as the master of her home and the master of her children. The modern 70s, 80s housewife is this kind of figure who's just kind of duped by market forces and is a kind of willing consumer, and who actually, you know, limits her children's capacity for self-realization. Another quote from the Gay Liberation Front manifesto, it goes on, "Gay shows the way. In some ways, we're already more advanced than straight people. We are already outside the family, and we have already, in part at least, rejected the masculine or feminine roles society has designed for us. In a society dominated by the sexist culture, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for heterosexual men and women to escape their rigid gender role structuring and the roles of oppressor and oppressed. But gay men don't need to oppress women in order to fulfill their own psychosexual needs, and gay women don't have to relate sexually to the male oppressor. So that at this moment in time, the freest and most equal relationships are most likely to be between homosexuals." So what we have here is the kind of voice from the margins, a claim of the oppressed to be the vanguard against repression within the family and the oppression of individuals excluded from it. Quickly to move on to the subsequent backlash in the 80s, which is what most of us probably, I don't know, certainly my first thoughts on this were about that being the most typical period of culture war over the family. Looking back now, the very explicit culture wars that many of us will remember from the 80s and 90s seem to be over the form of the family and gender roles within it, between marriage and non-marriage, marriage and divorce, between two-parent families and one-parent families, between families constituted of a man and a woman and families of same-sex parents, between families that were naturally produced through heterosexual reproduction and families which were produced using technology. There was a particular focus on the maternal role, working motherhood and latchkey kids, children in daycare looked after by other women who did not love them, and predictions of what kind of children this would produce. But looking back now at that period, I sort of just did a bit of a sort of delve into it and reminded myself of, and it's an interesting thing to kind of refresh something that was sort of a formative memory and experience, I suppose. The voices of conservative conviction in the UK in particular stand out in the figure of a kind of minority of really rather peculiar individuals. There was God's cop, James Anderton, Mary Whitehouse, Victoria Gillick, David Alton, who at the time, I think some of us would have been, writing propagandizing against, and very worried that this was an indication of a kind of heavyweight Victorian values backlash. But actually, when you look at what was being argued, mainstream politicians were very reluctant to moralise. Instead, they tended to attack the financial responsibility of single mothers or feckless fathers, and actually left the moralising to these other kinds of more marginal characters. The pro-family message tended to be negative and reactive in character. It is one of moral decline, reluctant mothers and absent fathers, failing to fulfil their mother-father roles. The family was reduced to an economic unit that saved the state money, or was instrumentalised as a tool of social order which could prevent rioting. Marriage in the form of various royal weddings became a sort of over-the-top pantomime designed to make us go gooey over traditional romance. And in rather the same way that the Falklands War was a sort of, when you look back at it now, as a kind of pantomime version of an imperialistic venture. In the longer term, it just bred further cynicism that motherhood was antithetical to the interests of women, and that marriage and family life were a sort of trick to keep us all docile, either as consumers or as workers. Who could convince, by that stage, the kind of social shifts that had taken place in the position of women relative to men made it very difficult to argue convincingly in defence of the virginity testing of Lady Diana before her marriage, or of her vows to obey her husband. That was one of the controversies of the time. Was she going to include obedience to her husband in her marriage vows? She didn't. And also, looking at the recent Margaret Thatcher documentary, you do kind of think it is quite odd to try to, how could you possibly defend stay-at-home motherhood at a time when we have a female prime minister? And there's a very, very interesting interview as part of that documentary with Thatcher talking about her decision to go back to work very, very early, despite having very young twins. And you can see how impossible it is for her to really kind of convincingly make a case for conservative family values. I'm not saying it's a personal it doesn't emanate from the personal, but it's kind of interesting the position that she was in. Any kind of richer sense of the father's role by this stage, other than as a breadwinner, which if you think about it, is a really quite an insulting characterisation of what fathers do. They win bread for their families. They kind of bung some food their way. It's a very diminished version of the paternal role compared to what had gone before. Or as the disciplinarian, by the 70s this had really been undone. And culturally, by the 70s, Dad was out of touch. He was a male chauvinist pig, a term that I used to throw around all the time in the 70s and 80s. He would sit in front of the telly making pronouncements at which the rest of the family would roll their eyes and carry on regardless. I'm thinking of Alf Garnett, who in the US was Archie Bunker, and apparently there was a version in Germany as well, which people can confirm, called Alfred Tetzlaff, all based on Alf Garnett. And during the 1980s, attacking or defending the family becomes a focal point, I think, when traditional morality, especially sexual morality in a broader sense, is given up on. So it's really interesting when you look at the kind of disputes over pornography. Conservatives seem to sort of pick symbolic fights with signs of permissiveness, like against pornography. But actually, in the UK especially, it very quickly gets limited to child pornography. And homosexuality, any kind of attempt to problematise it as being associated with promiscuity or sexual practices, becomes very limited, actually in Clause 28, to homosexuality as a pretended family relation. This is not about gays having promiscuous sex. It's about gays who want to be respectable and have children. So it does, I think, as a consequence of this, there's a convergence around the idea of the vulnerable child, vulnerable to child pornography, for example. And the vulnerable child becomes a moral pivot who's capable of securing consensus in the absence of any other points of consensus. Hence, the paedophile becomes a huge cultural disciplinary figure, legitimating restrictions on adult and child freedom, putting a wedge between adults as risky and children as at risk. On the other hand, homosexuality becomes freed from its association with sexual perversion, and gays become respectable as adopters, foster carers, parents, and after that, husbands and wives. So to conclude, where is the family at and what really matters about it? And these aren't really, they're not full conclusions, obviously, they're just where I got to at the end of the lecture. So I think there's still a recognition that parents need to be responsible. That hasn't gone anywhere as a presumption. And in fact, at least in officialdom, this responsibility has been expanded and extended backwards into pregnancy and preconception, and extended forwards into young adulthood. So, your period of parental responsibility is far longer than it ever would have been for my parents' generation, I think. As far as normal people go, the need to do good parenting has become a shared value, I think. It's a divisive one, however, since what constitutes good parenting is not agreed upon and keeps changing all the time. Criticism of the nanny state still resonates with the public because direct invasions of privacy are still experienced as an insult to our dignity as parents. And even if you accept intervention in some respects, you will reject them in other areas. The idea of a kind of total intervention in your family life, I think, would be horrifying to most people. But the friendly intruders, or the apps on your phone, which seek to guide you in the task of parenting, they very rarely directly confront your authority as a parent. Rather, they try to go alongside you, and they seek to share your authority and to shape it, appealing to our appetite to do a good job. Thirdly, I think no one thinks that the state can directly substitute for the parent. We're all aware of the abuses and lack of care in alternatives to the family. In fact, it's become harder to imagine strangers being motivated by a benign impulse to be involved in the care of our children. So actually, the focus continually comes back onto the family, even though there's very little faith in the family's ability to do these tasks that we tend to still assume need to be done. So we don't see an explicit issuing of licenses to parent, nor forced sterilisation of the unfit. A weaker form of liberalism seems to still prevail, but in some ways this just demonstrates a rather paralysing lack of faith in parents, other people, and in state action. But overall, I think there is a profound discomfort with parental agency. Parents are required to share authority or to mediate it through expert-informed reflexive practice. Hope is placed, on the other hand, in the child's agency, but this is highly curtailed to a very small window of opportunity where they can be formed for good or ill during the first 1,001 days of life. And they're defined, their agency, miscalled, I think, misnamed, is defined by their vulnerability. It's not actually agency, but a state of being determined and fixed by external forces. For the individual, therapeutically conceived, there is no expectation of an end point where internalised self-discipline and moral independence, the markers of individuation, are achieved. It's therefore difficult to see how such individuals can be conceived of as adequate parents themselves without the constant scaffolding by external actors to support them in their reflexivity. And so to go back to one of the points that Frank made this morning about what happens to these kind of concepts and concepts of hierarchy, I think overall I would argue that the distinction between adults and children has been substantially dissolved in the same way that the distinction between public and private has been dissolved. So whereas in the past the family had independence from the state and from the market, today the parent is brought into being only through state or semi-state action, and the child is instrumentalised as a tool for disciplining adults, as a repository for adult identity formation. Thank you.
Okay, we've got the microphones. We'll start over here, Josephine, and then the next two back, and then we'll come over here.
Hello. Yeah. It was just a question about the quote that gels with me. The quote that you quoted about children, they're given their first name and they associate that with their gender, and then their second name and they associate that with their kin or their family, and then they think, where do I go next, and where am I associating next? Do you think that process of your first name and your need to associate with your gender is a fundamental to creating some sense of identity that then becomes a kind of individual autonomy within the family?
Okay, let's pass it backwards.
Your talk prompts me to ask, does anybody in your field actually read any relevant science? Sorry, Steve Moxon. About 20 years ago, a woman called Judith Rich Harris, who'd spent 30 years writing textbooks on developmental psychology, wrote a brilliant tome called The Nurture Assumption. And her oral conclusion was, is you have to be an extremely bad parent indeed to have any significant negative impact on your offspring. And some more recent relevant research, although it's on a mammalian model, but the one way you can really bugger up your offspring is if you put certain forms of stress on the male parent. If you do that, then you can actually, F1 through F3, female offspring, you can actually reduce not only fertility, but actually produce, quote, aberrant reproductive-related behaviour. Maybe that's an explanation of feminism.
Behind you over there, and then come down and start here on this side.
Hi, my name's Patrick. I was wondering throughout this, not just your talk, about how you see the role of the state, because the state has responsibility for spending money on behalf of the public. It has a responsibility to form legal relationships within which people work. And the emphasis seems to be that the state is encroaching on people's private life if it expresses values or opinions in forming those necessary behaviours. So I'm just wondering what kind of state you envisage, one that stands back completely from the family and doesn't make value judgments on how to spend taxpayers' money, doesn't make value judgments on what laws and guidelines it should issue? Or are you simply saying that there should be more of a debate and discussion about what the state's role should be in that?
Okay, I'm going to take three here and then come back to that side. So here, then Jane, and then the lady in blue.
Okay, I'm Greg from Culture on the Offensive. I wanted to ask you if you think that the invasion of the parenting private sphere by the states and other private organizations could be a function of the fact that the capitalist Western society that we live in is actually getting quite better in the last 100 years, in the sense that crime rates are going down, education levels are going up, and so on and so forth. There's all these statistics that are being bandied about how things are so much better now than they were 100 years ago, and especially 200 years ago. And I want to know if you think maybe the downside of things going up is that there's more of an attempt to control the social realm and make it perfect. And the price we pay for making it perfect is the invasion of privacy of the private sphere, basically, by either state organizations or private organizations. I want to know what you thought about that.
Okay. Pass it back to Jane then. Sorry, I can see your hand, lady in blue. Don't need to stretch so much.
I think this is just an extension of the question that came up in last session, which is the state us? And I think the point, Jan, you're making about for all individuals now, there seems to be no concept of an end point. So in that sense, that creates that dynamic that parents need to be have this external framework from the state. But in some ways, that's individuals within the state, particularly within parenting classes or breastfeeding experts or whatever, individuals themselves from the state intervening in the family life, who themselves presumably are individuals with no coherent endpoint. Do you see, so in some ways, how does that work? Or is then this paralysis between having to rely on the family in some ways, as you say, the state can't step in, but with people themselves within the state who themselves are individuals without autonomy, I guess we'd say, in the same way. So how is that working, I guess?
Okay, so can you pass the microphone back? I'll then take a couple more from this side, and then John. Back to the lady in blue, Sally.
Thank you. Just one very brief observation and one question for you. So I really like the photographs you had of the traditional-looking family, compared to today. I felt that there was no sort of recognition of the family as an economic unit or the historical context for those pictures. It felt rather romantic view in a sense. The idea that there was stability in that picture on the left, and the idea that the state didn't interfere at that time when, you know, the man was removed from that picture and sent to war, and men were removed, and there was terrible infant mortality. So that picture on the left of that family from history was torn apart and taken apart many times through the history that we know of the 20th century in particular. And the removal of a man in the family equaled terrible destitution for those mothers and children that were left behind. So I just wanted to make that observation because I was thinking, when is the economic purpose of the family going to come through? And then just, I suppose related to that, when you came up to the present day, I think you said that the idea of the man in a family as a provider was an insulting role. And I just wondered, why is it thought of as insulting, the idea that the man would be the provider?
Okay, so microphone over here. So Alka, and then straight behind Alka. And then do you want to say a couple of things?
No rush.
Thank you, Jan. I just wanted to give a quick speculative thought on a slightly different aspect linked to Frank's session when he said he talked about the importance of the past and our relationship with the past, and how in the current contemporary cultural war the trends are towards breaking with the past. And that got me thinking about the family and being pregnant, and how, I mean, when you have a baby, you can't help but think of the future because you are automatically future orientated. But it seems to me that with a more traditional older family, and also the family in other cultures, what tends to happen is that is an opportunity to then reconnect. You know, why in India, pregnant wives often go back to their maternal homes after having left at marriage. They go back to reconnect with the kind of experiential knowledge and wisdom and the rest of the family to get that support. But here, the contemporary culture around pregnancy and having a family is that it's all totally new. You're entering a completely new world, and you're in it afresh as a newbie with like a tabula rasa, which of course opens you up to the kind of interventions that you've described. But, you know, on another level, it's also kind of, it's avoiding that link with, you know, when you have a baby, you could also think it's a reconnection, not just with your past as in help from your mother, but a tradition, your family tradition, and, you know, you go forwards and backwards. It expands our chronological maps in which we situate ourselves. And perhaps that's being shrunken today. So speculative, but just a thought. And maybe pregnancy rituals, is there any work on that might shed light on that?
So behind Alka, and then Jan's going to say a couple of things.
Something that's really interested me, and particularly after reading some of the material that your research has produced, is why in a period when there is such questioning about science and so much interrogation of expertise and denigration, really, of expertise, it is really interesting in relation to the family how much expertise is not questioned at all. In particular, the sort of biological ideas of the early years and the importance of these crucial first few years of life, and the fact that parenting can be responsible, in fact, for a child and society's problems, throughout life. And this popularization of the inadequacy of parenting because of this crucial period. And it is remarkable, actually, that the agencies of the state have such power, really, through this sort of degradation of science, actually, this biologization of child rearing. And I wondered to what extent the invasion of the family and privacy isn't that direct, apart from the removal of children from inadequate parents, which does go on. But I just wondered to what extent that is something new and really indicative of a cultural change in society.
Okay, so take Jan, and then we'll start back with Sally here on this side.
I'll kind of work back through those in the order. The thing is about you asking, I don't have time to think about. Sorry, I don't have time to think about the answers to the questions because I'm listening to the next question. Well, I think what you were saying there, Jenny, relates to what Alka was saying, which is I think the effect of scientific claims making is to claim that everything is new and the old rules just don't apply, and that's certainly what I was writing about in the neuroparenting book, which is that it sort of looks like science, but it really is very, very disconnected from science itself. And there's some really good work that has, gone through that process of disconnection from actual scientific discoveries to the way in which science is used as a source of authority in the political sphere. And it really is in the political sphere. I mean, this is in the House of Commons debates, it's in the kind of policy world where there's very explicit harnessing of scientific language, if not scientific substance, to make kind of claims about the early years. And I think that it does serve the purpose of deauthorizing any kind of existing sources of knowledge about how children are raised. So the kind of catchphrase is, we now know. We now know because of what we know about children's brains. We didn't know it before, and now we do. So the thing that's really curious is that what's actually prescribed as a result of that isn't really any different to what people already do. It is the norms of infant care as people have been doing them since, probably the 1960s, which is that, you hold your baby quite a lot. You don't really just leave them to cry for hours on end. You're fairly responsive to how you do it, and you sort of smother them in an awful lot of affection and love. It's just that you have to do it earlier and you have to do more of it. So it's closed and also open-ended at the same time. So I think it does actually contribute to this sense of uncertainty, because what you see when you look at the way mothers talk about the effect that this advice has, it doesn't actually guide their actions, because they're left with well, I got my baby up this morning and put them on their tummy for a certain amount of time because that's what you're supposed to do. But how long are they supposed to be on their tummy? If they don't like it, am I supposed to keep them there? And so it's disrupted the kind of advice you might just get from your own mother. And, grandmothers have been really traduced in all of this, because they are the ones who put the baby on the back to sleep or the front to sleep. I can't remember which way around it is. I think they're the ones that put the babies face down, and then with the whole kind of cot death fear, you had to put them on their back. And there was there's all that kind of advice. Weaning advice changes from one child to the next. It was 6 months at which you're supposed to wean them onto solid food, and now it's 4 months. And then that will change again. So, and there's a real self-consciousness amongst people that this is in flux. Everybody knows and everybody laughs about the fact that it changes. And when you have a conversation with your own parents about how to raise children, that's what they'll say. Well, it wasn't like that in my day. And they don't necessarily assume that the new advice is right. But there's just a kind of break that's happened. And I think for the parents who really are aspiring to develop their identity through raising their children, they're the ones that are most prone to take on board this kind of this advice, and they're the ones that then go to war with other parents over advice, and they kind of disseminate it further. So it isn't, and they're the ones that wouldn't actually, they would also doubt official state advice. So there's a whole kind of bunch of parents who would see themselves as the kind of vanguard of new parenting methods, who will be very critical of state official advice because they think it's behind the times. So, baby-led weaning comes about from, certain groups of parents, as does lactivism, the kind of very militant pro-breastfeeding kind of movement. So the state kind of disseminates these things which are already out there, really, as kind of forms of identity that some people are finding meaningful. On your question about the family as an economic unit, Yeah, fine. I wasn't saying that I do think there's something really important, and there is actually something meaningful about being a breadwinner. I wasn't saying that isn't meaningful. I do think it is, but it's much reduced from a man who has other kinds of responsibilities for the family as well, for the development of his child's education, of their moral development, their spiritual development. All those kinds of things go far beyond bringing in a salary. And that's not to denigrate bringing in a salary, but it's, the breadwinner is it's a very reduced form of authority within the home.
Okay. Sally, and then we'll take a couple over here, and then we'll go back to the middle over there. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think you've answered it a little bit, but the idea you said at the beginning, the family as a bridge between the individual and society and the state. And then you've looked, I think, at how the family's fragmented over a period of time. And then therefore, what, I suppose I'm trying to get my head around, and can you explain a little bit more, what does that mean? Because then what you're even just describing as the relationship of the parent to the family is it's a much narrower relationship. So then when we were talking earlier about the sovereignty of the individual, which requires something to come from, if you like, to be sovereign in relation to, where does that go? Can you just explain that a little bit more?
So I just want to go back to this morning. I think Angus talked about social tension versus social sabotage. And then there were some points made later on about the culture wars possibly actually having a destructive effect on capitalism itself. And what I just want to talk about is the work-life balance issue, and how, in my experience, I work in human resources, the family is now drawn on as some reason to not be at work quite a lot. So it's not just the formal, family leave type of things, but all sorts of informal situations, informal arrangements whereby people say they're at work but they're at home taking care of elderly people or young people, children, babies. And there doesn't seem to be an ability for employers, and this isn't just regulatory, it is also cultural, to respond to that in any kind of way that might say, actually, no, you need to perform according to your contract, you need to carry out the duties of your job. There is a real use of the family for that, and it might be to do with the fact that there is lack of trade unionism, there's a lack of other sort of collective assertion of employee rights, but the family now seems to be that site of challenging the employer.
Okay, yeah. Go, just pass it back to behind you. And then over here to James, just straight in front of you.
I wondered if you discussed at all the idea of parental discipline, because it's something in relation to the smacking campaign that I've met a lot of Christians who have a very clear idea of what they mean by parental discipline, because they have a template which comes from the Bible, and what the church and their congregation that they're part of tell them. But then when you take it into the secular world, it becomes really difficult to explain what you mean by parental discipline. And I was talking to a minister trying to explain why I thought this issue was important, and they were undermining it. And you could see that when I described the experience of being smacked as a child, she genuinely felt that I had been scarred through that experience. And it seemed to me that the concept of discipline is been entirely alienated from secular society as a product of psychology. So when she explains it, she's sort of saying discipline is the exercise of power by one person against another. Discipline is the suppression of your desires, and discipline is, in and of itself, highly problematic. The only areas where we're allowed to exercise self-discipline is in relation to things like sport, but where we encourage our children to do a certain thing, then that seems to be a power relation. I wonder how you develop a critique of that without going into look at psychology and the way that particular psychological outlook has influenced contemporary imagination.
Okay, so James here, and then I'll take a few behind James, and then Jan again.
This is a slightly argumentative point, and I don't really mean it that way, but in the way that you proceeded with setting out an ideal type, derived from the way people talk, you say these are the ideals, it does kind of raise a question of, does the empirical experience deviate from the ideal type? I mean, to say that, people talk a lot about families, but the statistics say most families, overwhelmingly the lion's share of families are a married couple raising kids. I think it's something like 180,000 single-sex couples, not that many. Thank you. And also that when you presented with a kind of an ideal which is actually quite demanding in terms of self-sacrifice, in the way that people are describing the best way to be a parent, seems to exact a tremendous cost. But then you'd have to reconcile with that. As a country, we don't ask all that much of ourselves in most circumstances. Most people would dodge about, and given that a lot more people are spending a lot more time at work, how are people seriously going to reconcile all these ambitions with the practicalities of everyday life? I mean, to say, aren't these ideals a little bit unrealistic?
So just go back. Oh, have you got? Yeah. Okay. Fine, Jacob, and then go forward to Anne.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne. That was a real sort of tour de force through the discourse, if you like, around the family. But I guess I wanted to push you a little bit on the more sort of the experience of women as it happens through history, being involved in society, and how that might differ. The one example that springs to mind, which was something that my mum always used to say, but I was recently reading accounts of post-war working-class families, and especially them moving out to suburbs and what that meant for them. And the thing that came through over and over again from that was women often being the people who instigated the move, asking their husband if they could move out into one of these new houses in the suburb, because they wanted to get away from their in-laws, they wanted to get away from their prying neighbours, they wanted to get away, in some cases, from their mother. And that, although it made them, in one sense, slightly more isolated, they didn't have their mother to rely on or their in-laws to leave their kids with, it was also an expression of their agency, of getting away from and starting to strike out on themselves. And I would totally take the response that said, well, this then opens up the possibility for the state and other sort of the people who create the discourse around this to say, oh, there are all these now vulnerable, isolated families and vulnerable, isolated women. But I guess I just want to push you on the degree to which we should celebrate that fact of it being, at least initially, a sort of positive step through.
Anne, yeah.
Yeah, it's Anne. I think that's a really good point, and I think what it does is it throws up the tension that really exists between the intimacy of the family and the importance of that on the one hand, and also sometimes the kind of tension and desire to break out of it. But I think it is really important to emphasize something about the importance of the intimacy of family relations. Somebody mentioned they really liked the quote, Jan, that you threw up about, I am given my name and that tells me that I'm a girl or a boy. I've got my family, I know who I am. And I think that sense of defining who we are is incredibly important, and the family is an important part of that, because we define ourselves as who we are quite significantly by defining ourselves by who we are not. And I think that that's one of the most worrying things about the trends in society at the moment, that they're moving more away, as we move more away to the kind of fluidity of who we are. We move away from the I know I'm a girl because I'm not a boy, to that very fundamental difference as being so fluid it becomes very undefining. And then if you think about some of the points that you were saying, and also Frank referred to this morning, about parents being flattened out into mere caregivers, and indeed when we look after our parents, we become caregivers, that sort of specificity of intimate roles within the family kind of moves. And I think that, we've talked about the family as being a bridge to society, but a traditional important role of the family has also been a boundary around ourselves, which is a kind of boundary of trust that keeps others out and that enables us to have a relationship of confidence that we wouldn't have with other people. And, you know, many of us may remember our parents sort of saying, well, you know, you don't talk about that to other people. You know, that is something that we know. And that's something that has always existed, but is now completely pathologized. That's seen as being part of the problem. So I think an important part of the family, whether we like it or not, or however you are geographically, that sense of a special bounded relationship is very important. Can I just ask one question? Because I'm very interested in why... In how young people are in relation to the family at the moment. And the fact that if you look at in this country, there's a rising age of which people have first births. Recently come back from Italy, where I was involved in a deep participant observation study with one person at a dinner party who was explaining to me the birth rate in Italy being at the moment 1.1, you know, which is Italy, this is. Italy, strongly Catholic country where family is everything, right? 1.1. And he was saying that he thought it was partly to do with people living at home longer. They don't want to go off and start their own family. And partly because they felt very uncertain about starting a new family because it seems so complicated. So what do we think that's about?
Okay, Ella?
Just quickly, it might be too big to bring up now, but I was thinking about the way in which we talk about fluidity with the culture wars and the kind of anything goes nature of the changing concept of the family. But you could argue that one thing that hasn't changed, that actually possibly has hardened in terms of its sort of traditional role, is motherhood, in terms of women's role as the, to use the caregiver word, predominant caregiver. It's largely unchanged in terms of, you made a joke about the politicians not getting up for nightly feeds, but that's true, that it's still women who do the lion's share. And anyone who's involved in pro-choice activism will know that when you come up against people who are anti-choice, there's a very solidified view of the minute a woman gets pregnant, her sense of self and her autonomy and her individuality is just cut off and is replaced by being a mother. And I mean, that's hardening now in relation to the work you've done around breastfeeding, proves the kind of, even though the shallow sense of a culture war of everything shifting actually is hardening gender roles in terms of, you know, if you are expecting a woman to breastfeed 24 hours a day for 6 months, that's, you know, that's a really intense view of a woman's role being almost literally tied to the kitchen sink or tied to the breast pump. So, you know, how do you explain that, the fact that actually you could argue that in terms of the family, mothers' roles have not changed?
Okay, Kevin here, and then over here to Fiona. I think that might have to be it. And then I'm going to bring Jan in, obviously, at the time.
Jan, two questions. You were talking about how you were assessing maybe differently people like John Anderton, Victoria Gillick, etc. Betty Friedan was always a hero of mine. I always loved her and thought she was a great battler. Her, apologies to people who don't know her book, The Feminine Mistake, which she talked about the problem of no name and the estrangement and alienation of women and the desire to go out and get a job as well as have a family. How should we look back on her? Should we be much more critical than I have been? I've always loved her and that book. So that's the first question. The second question is about Freddie McConnell. And leaving gut instinct to the side, what should we think about that? I was listening to Radio Ulster in my back garden in London on the iPad the other day, and there was a 1 hour phone-in on Radio Ulster called Talkback, and all the locals were phoning in from across the north of Ireland, slagging off this idea that you could change your sex and be a father. And they had this activist in the studio, and he was dealing with all these ordinary punters on the phone, and basically was really suave and articulate. And by the end, it felt as if a lot of the people had sort of like whittled down their opposition, their common sense opposition to this idea of being a woman, changing to a man, whatever, blah, blah, blah. What's your general thoughts about the implications of the Freddie McConnell issue for the family and generally the culture war?
Okay. Over here, Fiona.
Thank you. Fiona McEwen. I was just sort of thinking about what this, how this sort of links to what Frank was talking about the sort of rejection of the values of old. I mean, I think you really see that in families where there's this idea that the way the previous generation did things in terms of looking after babies and such like that, all those ideas are wrong and everything's sort of different now. So, the flippant examples like, parents used to think that you had to dry babies out with lots of talcum powder, but now you have to put olive oil on them to sort of slick them up, this sort of 180-degree shift in lots of areas. And so that sort of does a couple of things. So it creates that anxiety that everything is new and we have to sort of, start again with everything. But it also then puts that barrier in between the generations. So you hear these tortured discussions about parents who want their grandparents to help because they need the practical help, but then that sense that they'll do everything wrong. So should I let them look after children? What if they give them the wrong foods and so on? So it sort of puts in a sort of further intergenerational barrier. But then also does that become self-perpetuating because if children are constantly getting the message that their grandparents are doing everything wrong because their ideas are out of date, then again, do you just sort of further feed into and perpetuate those ideas about the break between generations?
Okay, John, last one, but can you keep it brief, please?
David Goodhart, in his book on the Anywheres and the Somewheres, has a very good chapter on family policy, where he points out that over the last 30 years or so, family policy has really been dominated by the interests of career men and career women, the Anywheres, as he calls them. And I think you can see that in the sense that family life is now dominated by the notion of equality, which of course suits career men and career women, and also equality in preference to traditional roles. But I think the problem is that most men and women do not have careers. They have jobs. And if you have a job, then of course you don't get your affirmation from the workplace. You get a lot of your affirmation and your social status from what you do at home. And that's why it's so important for a lot of ordinary men and women that they have traditional roles. So the man, for example, does benefit from being seen as the breadwinner. The woman benefits from being seen as the person in charge of the household and bringing up the family. And I do think that we've rather lost touch with the importance of those traditional roles. And it is because so much family policy has come to be dominated by the interests of that narrow strata of middle class men and women.
Okay, so I'm going to bring Jan in now just to say, well, we finish at 15:15 and then it's just a short break to 5:30 and you need to be back in here at 5:30.
Well, luckily there's not enough time to answer these questions. You can chase me around the conference centre for the rest of the weekend. I don't know the answers to loads of them, to be honest. I don't agree with you, John. I mean, there's something there. I didn't think Goodhart was particularly convincing, actually, because I think even in jobs, people do find satisfaction. It's not comparable with the satisfaction you have with your family. It's not the same. It's not the same thing. But the idea that somehow it's only kind of lawyers and solicitors and academics who kind of, are fulfilled by work, I think is not true. And I do think there's a huge benefit to women of being in the workplace. I don't think that should be valued above all else. But I do think it's incredibly important. I'm extremely grateful that that has been possible compared to the lives of previous generations of women. Freddie McConnell, I think what's really interesting is just what the law will make of it. And I think the law is such an interesting thing where, it is very, very conservative very often. And Macfarlane is a really interesting character in this respect. And it's very delicate, and the fact is, in the law, it can't just be changed overnight. It's a really serious consideration has to be given, which is what's happening here, to all of the various knock-on effects of changing this. What it's about is documentation, and it's the child's identity that's in question here, which is what's so interesting about the case. Whether he, becomes a woman or a man in a way is not very interesting. Whether he has a baby, it's not so interesting. But except for the fact that when he becomes, in order to become a parent, Freddie McConnell has to go through a fertility clinic that has to assess his ability to be a supportive parent, and there's a kind of process that goes on there. But that also equally now applies to married couples who go for fertility treatment. They also have to have their ability to be supportive parents assessed. What Ellie and I found when we researched into that is actually nobody knows what supportive parenting really means. Nobody's able to really give it any substance, and yet it's something that clinic staff have to tick the box of. But I think what's really interesting, and when I first heard about the Freddie McConnell case, before I knew it was, who it was actually that he so quickly made the move to try to change the birth certificate. And that doesn't really matter to the child, I wouldn't have thought particularly. It sits in a filing cabinet, you bring it out every now and then, whether your mother was a male or is now a male or a female. It was about the affirmation for Freddie McConnell of his status through the documentation of his child's coming into being into the world. And I think that really does say a lot about what's happened with the family. And that's why, there is a kind of, there is a lot of layers in between what we actually do and what we think we're doing when we do it. And I think that's the thing about family life. There's all kinds of, sort of pressures and necessities that come about from having children and, falling in love and setting up homes together and buying properties together, all those things which still go on. Albeit, with some delay here and, other things going on there. But it's what we think we're doing when we do it that is the thing that changes. And that's where the space comes in to transform those relationships into something very different and primarily to increase a sense of distance between the figures involved in the family, which I think is the most kind of destructive aspect of all of this.
That it?
Yeah.